Hello, hello. Welcome to Inner Beauty TV. I'm your host, Nicole Michelle, founder and femininity mentor for the Inner Beauty movement. We're all about helping women reconnect with their feminine power, their core, and simplifying the pathway to marriage. So, if that is something you'd be interested in, we'd love to have you on our channel to join our tribe. And to all of you joining me for the very first time, welcome. And to those of you returning, we appreciate you. And as always, I promised that I would come with some really good interviews and femininity content. And I want to start a series. This is the first installment of a series that I'm doing highlighting classic femininity. And I couldn't think of a better person than Mrs. Hazel Scott. She was a phenomenal woman. And I just want to continue with her beautiful memory. She was so beautiful, so feminine, so elegant. Some of the traits that a lot of women need and want and desire. And so I would love to have a conversation about her. And joining me today is none other than her son, Adam Clayton Powell III. Welcome, Mr. Powell. Hello, Adam. Is that okay for me to call you Adam?
Please, yes, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very, very much for coming to the Inner Beauty TV. So let's start with who are you and how do you know Mrs. Hazel Scott?
Well, most people see or hear or read my name, Adam Clayton Powell III, and they immediately think of my father, the Congressman and Minister Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And a few people still remember my grandfather, Adam Sr., who built the largest Protestant congregation in the United States. And my father expanded that. I guess now it would be called a mega church, but it was the largest church, not only in Harlem, but in the United States. But now, these days, it's my mother, Hazel Scott, who's actually getting more attention than my father. And that's because people have rediscovered her or discovered her anew on YouTube, where there are clips of her movies and her performance and her interviews. And people keep emailing me, who is this amazing person? Why haven't I heard of her before? So she is now becoming much better known. Dance Theater of Harlem created a ballet about her called Sounds of Hazel, which premiered 3 months ago here in Washington. There is a PBS primetime special that's going to be on early in 2023 about her. And so suddenly it's Hazel Scott who's suddenly getting a lot of attention.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, for those of the young people who listen to me, give us a brief description or bio of your father, if you don't mind. So, kind of set the context of this extraordinary couple.
My father was born in 1908 in New Haven, Connecticut. He and my grandfather were not yet in New York. My grandfather was the pastor of a church in Connecticut, and they moved to New York. And my grandfather became the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which at the time was across the street from the Metropolitan Opera House on 40th Street in Midtown Manhattan. And my grandfather moved the church to Harlem, to what was then mostly a green pasture. And I remember my grandfather died when I was 7, and I remember asking him if he ever had any regrets about moving the church, and he said his only regret was that he didn't buy the entire block. But the church thrived. They paid off the mortgage in the Depression. And my father grew up very much in the church, and he helped start soup kitchens in Harlem during the Depression. He entered politics and became the first black congressman from New York and the second post-Reconstruction black congressman in the United States. He rose to be the chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, where he was saluted by then President Lyndon Johnson as the most productive committee chairman in the history of the United States. My mother, he met my mother while he was still in the New York City Council before he became a member of Congress. And my mother was much more famous. She was already a big movie star. And what each of them told me separately is that my father said that he would not marry my mother until after he was elected to Congress because he didn't want to be Mr. Hazel Scott.
Wow. Wow. Now see, we're gonna delve into that. Absolutely. So for those of you who watch the channel, I don't know, Adam, if you've had a chance to watch any of my recorded videos, but I always end every live stream with saying, keep the faith, baby. So for everybody who don't know where I got that from, I actually took that from Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was one of my heroes, by the way. So tell us, you said she was already a star when they met. So tell us about who is Hazel Scott and tell us briefly about her journey and how did she get to New York?
She was born in 1920 in Port of Spain, Trinidad. And at age 3, she and her mother left Trinidad. And when she was 4 years old, she arrived in New York. And they moved to 116th Street in Harlem. And at one point, when she was still a little girl, she started playing tunes on the piano just from listening, from hearing them. And she would play tunes on the piano, and her mother and her grandmother would say, who is that? Who's that playing the piano? And they would go in, and they couldn't believe that the little girl was playing the piano just by ear. And she was clearly a prodigy at age, oh my goodness, it was, I think she was 8 when she first was taken by her mother to the Juilliard School, one of the leading music schools in the United States and the world. And again, she was sitting at the piano and she was playing different pieces, including a Rachmaninoff composition, but her hands weren't large enough to play the chords that Rachmaninoff had written. And so she improvised playing reduced chords that her hands could handle. And the head of the Juilliard School came running down the hallway saying, who is murdering Rachmaninoff? Who is the crazy pianist who is murdering Rachmaninoff? And he opens the door and he sees the little girl playing, and he realizes that she was improvising, making the chords smaller to fit her hands. And he looked and he said, why, she's a genius. And years before she was eligible, they admitted her to Juilliard School for professional piano. And she studied classical piano. She, of course, was surrounded by jazz in Harlem, and grew up with many friends who were musicians. And she played with different bands. As a teenager, she had a radio show of her own, and she was the star of the first. This is going to sound strange. The first integrated nightclub in New York.
Wow.
That in New York City, the nightclubs were segregated. Yes, but the first integrated nightclub in New York was called Cafe Society. And they had a slogan. It was the wrong place for the right people, or the right place for the wrong people. But in any event, their big star when it opened was Billie Holiday, and she knew my mother and as a much younger person, and insisted that when she ended her time at Cafe Society, she insisted to the owner, Barney Jason, that my mother succeed her. And so my mother succeeded the great Billie Holiday, and she would play different songs, different jazz pieces, but there was another pianist who sometimes was on the bill with her. And so when my mother would play, a jazz piece, somebody would come over and say, "Oh, we're very sorry. That's actually part of the other pianist's repertory." My mother would play another piece, and they'd come, "Oh, we're very sorry. That's part of the other pianist's repertory." So that's when my mother got the idea of playing classical works, Bach and Beethoven and others, but syncopating them. And so she would turn classical compositions into jazz. And she said, "Okay, let the other pianists try to do this." and and she became famous for swinging the classics was the phrase. Had lots of albums and was recruited by Hollywood, by the Hollywood studios, to come to Los Angeles and become a movie star. And when she left Cafe Society to move to California, the person who replaced her was Lena Horne. And so Billie Holiday, who preceded my mother, and Lena Horne, who followed my mother at Cafe Society, they became my two aunts, Aunt Billie and Aunt Lena. And it was all like family. But my mother went to Hollywood and became, we only recently discovered this, became the highest paid African-American performer in Hollywood.
Now, what time frame would this have been around?
I'm sorry, could you repeat this?
What time was that around? The 30s, the 40s?
This is now early 1940s. So she's just turned 20 years old.
Okay.
And she becomes this huge star in Hollywood. And her mother sent her best friend, her mother's best friend, to LA from New York to look after her. Because as you can imagine, here's this 20-year-old with unlimited money coming in. And in fact, my mother once said to me, she said, when she every now and then she'd go into the third person and she'd say, your mother was a holy terror. But think about it. She's making the kind of money that, I don't know, Tom Cruise makes today as a movie star. But Barney Josephson, the owner of Cafe Society, wrote her contracts for Hollywood. And in her contracts, it said she could never wear a uniform, so she couldn't play a maid, with one exception. She could wear the uniform of the United States military. That was the only exception. Mm-hmm. And so in one of her most famous movies, she actually is a lieutenant or a corporal, I forget which rank, but in the Women's Army Corps. But other than that, she would play herself. She would be Hazel Scott as Hazel Scott. And she would wear her own clothes, her own jewelry, so she became an even bigger star because she was in all these movies. And it was a career which could have gone on and on, except she always believed that women could not be depicted in an inferior way. And on one movie set, she walked in, and it was this is during World War II, and so and the Army was still segregated, and so she plays a member of the Women's Army Corps, and on a big musical production number, she's drilling these troops who are on the deck of a battleship about to sail across the Pacific to go to war, and their wives and girlfriends are up on the dock to see their husbands and boyfriends off to war. Well, the director of the movie was sick that day when they were shooting that scene, and the assistant director decided that wouldn't it be a great idea to have all the women wearing maids' outfits? My mother walked onto the soundstage and looked over and said, "What's going on? I mean, this is not the way we rehearsed it." This is something we thought that Black women should be dressed as maids. And she said, "No self-respecting woman is going to be dressed as a maid to see her husband or boyfriend go off to war and maybe not return. And I'm not going to do this scene until you change what they're wearing." Well, word reached the head of the studio that Hazel Scott is holding up production. And she refused to do the scene until they changed into more formal clothes. And she came out, did the scene. It's a wonderful scene. But the head of the studio said, "Hazel Scott will never make another movie as long as I live." Well, she had one more movie that she was under contract, and that was Rhapsody in Blue, the biography of George Gershwin. And she plays herself as the owner of a nightclub in Paris, and she welcomes George Gershwin to Paris. Well, at the time, she'd never been to Paris, but who knew that years later she would actually be living there? So, so that was the end of her career in Hollywood for years and years, for more than a decade. The next theatrical motion picture that she made in France, in French, opposite Jean Gabin, the biggest star in French movies at the time, in 1957, I think it was, 57, 58. And she was very excited to be back making movies. I remember when she came in after the first day of filming, when the studio sends the limousine to come and pick you up, take you to the studio, send you back. She came in, and I was doing homework, and I heard her scream. What's happening? I ran over. She was at the front door of our apartment, and I had always leave the Paris edition of the New York Herald Tribune. Now it's the New York Times. Then it was the New York Herald Tribune on the floor by the door, so she could pick it up as she came in. And she was staring down at the newspaper, and she said, look at the front page. And I looked at it. And on the bottom of the front page was an article. The man who said that she would never make another movie as long as he lived, he had dropped dead the day before.
Wow. Truly, what goes around.
Yes.
What goes around, it really comes around. So, wow. So she was successful over in France. I see. I didn't even know she made movies in France.
It's available now. Everything's available now on Amazon. But yeah, for years, no one in the United States knew about the movie.
No, see, and that's what I want to highlight her, because I'm glad that they're reviving her and keeping her memory alive, because she was just so beautiful and so elegant, and just a epitome of beauty and talent. So let's go back to the interesting stuff, because all of this is just really interesting and blowing my mind. Can you tell us about her courtship with the late great Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and how you came about?
Well, they met in 1945. In fact, I still have a pair of cufflinks that my mother gave my father. I don't know when she gave them to him, but it's August 1945, and there is a small red jewel in the date in the calendar when they met. They met in New York. My father, as I said, was a member of the New York City Council. He was going to be a candidate for Congress the following year in 1946. My mother said that after she met my father, my mother said she went home and said to her mother, said, "I'm so attracted to this man, I want to run away." And her mother told her, she always quoted, she told me this many times. She said that my mother told me, "No, a woman never runs away. You have to face him and do whatever you want to do, but you don't run away." And that was my mother. She would not run from anything. They were married in. I'm sorry, I've gotten the years wrong. They were married in August of 1945, so they met in 1944. I'm sorry. On their honeymoon, which was at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, because the place they had reserved in New England, when they heard who was coming, they said, "Oh, we're very sorry. We don't allow people of your race to stay in our resort." And remember, this is in New England. This is not the South. They switched plans, and their honeymoon was at the Waldorf Astoria. They would have the newspapers delivered. She was an avid reader of newspapers and of everything. One day, both my father and my mother told me this story separately. They both described how one day my father opened the door to their suite and looked down, and the big headline, banner headline in the newspaper was that the United States had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And he said, "My goodness, they've done it. They've split the atom." And my mother said, "Now come back inside. You know, enough physics. let's get back to let's get back to let's get back to our wedding." um, but I can imagine they were both such avid readers. They were both interested in so many things, including science, as well as the arts and politics. Um, and the one thing that I remember growing up strongly by them together was the belief that no one should be treated any less than anybody else, and both of them never, to use my grandmother's term, never ran away from it. They confronted it directly.
So that is awesome. I love that courtship story. I love it. I love it. So tell me about her charm school training, etiquette training. Did she receive any of that, or did she just know? Like, how did she become so elegant and so refined?
She always credited her mother. She said that her mother, and she always had a portrait of her mother wherever she lived. It was very prominent. She said that her mother taught her how to be a lady. I don't know if that term is now antiquated, but certainly it wasn't when she was growing up. And she said there are certain things that you do, certain things that you don't do. There are certain ways you behave. There are certain things you say, certain things you don't say. Um, but um, uh, but you're absolutely correct that it's just a way of living and behaving, and really it's part of yourself. I remember my mother at one point was, I forget the occasion, but she said, "I've entertained the crowned heads of Europe. I have entertained the most wealthy people in the world, and uh, and they always say, 'Oh, you're so graceful and you're so charming.'" And she said, "I don't know what they were expecting."
Yeah, to see a woman so elegant and refined, and I don't know about her. Like, I did know of her because of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., but to know that she had this vast career and reputation is just, we have to spread the word. We have to keep her memory alive, because normally when we talk about old Hollywood glamour, we always stick to the standbys. you know, Lena Horne, beautiful, Dorothy Dandridge. To know your mom came before Dorothy is like, who knew? Who knew? And that's the stuff we have to keep talking about and keeping in the forefront. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yes, and there's some things I didn't know or didn't remember. We there's a woman named Karen Shilton who spent 8 years researching my mother's life for a book that she wrote about her, and she found clippings and old contracts and documents. I've given everything now to the Library of Congress, so it's all public. But there was a clipping from 1950 from the English language newspaper in Baghdad, the Baghdad Post. And the article, a little article with a picture of the three of us, my mother, my father, and me at age, whatever I was, three or four, and said that Princess, not yet Queen, Princess Elizabeth had called from Buckingham Palace to ask my mother if she could come and play at a party she was having. And my mother, and the article quotes my mother saying, "Oh, I'm not doing anything else that weekend. Of course I'll come." And the three of us went.
Wow. That is extraordinary. Like, before Queen Elizabeth was queen, your mother was like, "Oh, okay, I'm not doing anything. Let me go see." You're like, that is awesome. That is so awesome. So I enjoyed this conversation about Hazel Scott. I think this is awesome. So tell us where we can find the upcoming events in honor of your mother. Where can we find her material, books on her that you may know about that accurately tell her story? That's what we want to do.
There's a book which is by far the best record of my mother's life. It's called Hazel Scott, From Cafe Society to the House of American Activities Committee. And it's by Karen Chilton, Chilton. And Karen has continued to research my mother's life. And I just saw her a month ago, and she said that she has enough now for a 700-page book, and she said that she really wants to bring out, a new expanded edition. And Karen is going to donate all of her notes and all of her materials to Harvard University, so that'll all become public. But it's so that's striking. You go to YouTube and just search on Hazel Scott, and you'll see all these clippings from her movies, all these clips from her movies, including the most famous one that people have discovered, where she plays two pianos at once.
That is awesome.
And she's playing one and the other, one hand on one hand on the other. She's playing two pianos at once, and then she spins around and reverses her hands. and and people say, that's amazing, that's amazing. Well, what happens? Alicia Keys, 2 or 3 years ago in the Grammys, she said, in honor of Hazel Scott, I'm going to play two pianos at once. And that's when a lot of people started to email me saying, what's this about the two pianos? And I said, just go to YouTube and look up Hazel Scott two pianos. Well, coming early in 2023, there's going to be a documentary about her life on PBS, on the American Masters series. We don't have a date yet. I was just asking the executive producer if they've given her a date yet, and she said no. They're still working on the schedule for early next year. So at some point it'll be very much alive. The broadcast, the Dance Theater of Harlem. If you go to their website, they have created a ballet about my mother, which is part of their repertory now, and it will. They've performed it around the country. It premiered here in Washington. They went to South Carolina. They went to Seattle. Been to different places. It'll be in New York starting in April, and so which is their home base in New York, and so it'll be. As I said, part of their repertory, and it's really striking. It's the piece is called "The Sounds of Hazel," and they actually asked me to do some voiceover. I said, I've never been in a ballet. I don't know if my shoes or my slippers are large enough, but they asked me to do voiceover so that I could introduce some of her life in Paris, where. I lived with her for a couple of years in Paris when I was, 12, 13, 14 years old. And I would come home from school and there'd be Lester Young on the couch. And Dizzy Gillespie would drop by when he was in town. And in fact, he may have been my mother's closest friend, certainly later in life. He was, when my mother died, he was actually in her hospital room, and he took his trumpet out and he put the mute in, and my mother was unconscious, and he started to play her favorite song, and she opened her eyes and smiled, and then died. And Dizzy turned to me and said, "You see what just happened? Did I do that?" And I said, "No, you made her happy." But she would invite anyone she knew coming through Paris to come to dinner. Sometimes it was the entire Duke Ellington band crowded into our apartment, and she would make a big pot of red beans and rice, which she wasn't supposed to do. She wasn't supposed to cook, play sports, or in any way do anything that would that could injure her hands. Her hands were insured for $1 million by Lloyd's of London, and so if anything had ever happened to them, they would pay her $1 million. But part of the insurance contract was, no cooking. So her mother would never let her see recipes and never let her write down recipes. No sports. So of course, what did my mother do? She said, "I can't have any fun." So she would cook. She was careful, so she didn't ever burn her fingers or anything. Um, but she did play sports, and the thing that the insurance company always worried about was she going to play tennis, where she could have injured her wrists? No, she never played tennis. She would go out on the street and play touch football, and she was the only non-guy on the street in these games, and so they would all try to pile on her. Yes, it was supposed to be touch, but they would try to pile on her. And she had this move that I later saw. What was his name? Joe Montana, the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers. He had a move when they were coming in to tackle him. He would take the ball and he would fold up under his stomach. Well, she had that move so that her hands would actually be protected. Uh, but she that was my mother. She'd be out there, but maybe that night go to Carnegie Hall and play a concert.
That had to be exciting growing up with the jazz classics of the time, the jazz stars of the time. Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington. Did you know Ella?
Yes, not as well as the others I mentioned, but it was a pretty small community. Everybody knew everybody, and there were so many shared experiences and common reference points that if they heard my mother was going to perform at a certain venue, they'd say, "Oh, watch out for so and so," or "The acoustics are really bad. You have to move the piano over to the side," or whatever. So everybody would sort of give each other tips.
That is so fascinating. I'm just so glad that we had this conversation. And as always, we'll keep in touch. As give me more information about the PBS special. I think this is long overdue. I think the younger generation has to be informed about all of the elegant women of the past. And we kind of stick to the same 4 or 5 people in Hollywood, but I think it's great that we expand the conversation and include the great, elegant, beautiful Hazel Scott. She was phenomenal, and she's definitely a good role model. She was a great mother, a great wife, and a great entertainer. So she balanced it all, and she just made it look so easy and so elegant. And when I see the clips of her, I'm just so fascinated. I'm like, wow, why didn't I know about this woman sooner? People are just discovering Dorothy Dandridge, but before Dorothy, there was Hazel. We have to give her her flowers. So is there anything else you would like to say as we bring this to a close?
Well,
Because
yes. You mentioned her role as a mother. Do you know what she used to do? She used to, wherever she was in the country, and she would tour the country playing concerts all over. And I would have a carbon copy of her touring schedule. So at age 4 or 5, I could always look up at the kitchen, and she would tack up the schedule. So I could see, oh, she's in Chicago today. She's playing in Chicago, or she's in St. Louis today. Wherever she was in the country, both of my parents did this. Friday night, there used to be something called night coach, flights that were in the middle of the night. They would fly to New York on Friday night so that Saturday morning, when I woke up, they would both be there. And we would have Saturday was our day, the three of us. And then Sunday, go to church. And so Sunday was for church and grandparents and the extended church family. But thinking about that, this is before jet planes. This is when you're flying on those old piston engine noisy planes. And they would get in 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and then they would sleep for a little bit and get up. But that was something which was important to her, and she was the first Black woman. Actually, we think the first Black person, man or woman, to have her own network TV series. And the reason she did it, this was in 1950, started in July of 1950. So I was 3 years old when it started. And the reason she wanted to do a network TV show was that it would give her a continuing base in New York so she wouldn't have to travel. so she could always be home. Her show was on early in the evening. It would be over by 8 o'clock. I think it was 7:30 to 8. And so at 8 o'clock, she could leave the studio in Manhattan and come home and be home every night and not have to travel. And she was very public about it. I'm doing television because I want to be home with my family. But still, she could be on television across the country, so everybody could see her. And there's something which those of us, I'm in my late 70s. I remember when anybody Black appeared on television, we'd call each other and say, "Turn on channel 2, turn on channel 2." But everybody knew that she was on. In fact, the show was so popular, they expanded it to 3 nights a week at 7:30. And she was happy because she could just, go into the studio, do the show. And her backup band was Max Roach on drums and Charles Mingus on bass. Wow. And of course, they both became stars after that.
Now, all the jazz aficionados know exactly who you're talking about, the great Max Roach. So that's phenomenal. But I love how you said she put family first. So she carved out her career around the family. She made it work. She put you and her husband first.
And summers we would travel. Summers 1950, 51, 52. We would travel because I was out of school, or and Congress was out, so the three of us could together go to Europe, which we did each summer. And she loved it there because she was the what they call the vedette américaine, the American star, and so she would play the biggest concert halls of Europe. And there was one time when she was doing television, and I was with her in the studio in Rome, and RAI, the Italian, the big Italian network at the time, and someone came out of the control room and started stuffing handkerchiefs around her neck, and she said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" They said, "The Pope is watching." They thought she needed to have more clothing around her neck. And of course, what happened? The Pope invited her and my father to come and see him.
Wow, that is extraordinary. Not only that, but I'm looking for your book too. That is just enlightening. I hope the ladies glean from this. I hope the fellas glean from this as well. I hope to meet you in person one day. We've been talking, corresponding for years now, and we finally had a sit down. It's long overdue, in my opinion. I think this is awesome. I'm looking forward to all of the things coming out about your mother, the late great Hazel Scott. She's awesome. She's beautiful. And those of you who are posting her online, keep doing it. Keep circulating it. Keep talking about her. Keep posting her, keep creating memes about her, keep her memory alive. The elegant women, the elegant Black women, we have to keep their memory alive and let people know this is the standard. This is the standard. She was fit, feminine, and friendly, and she was beautiful, and she was married, and she had a beautiful family, and she was talented, and she traveled the world. And so I think this is a great conversation. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining me today and having this conversation about your mother. Anything else?
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Anything you want to add as we tune out?
No, just that what many people thought was going to be the end of her career, the House Un-American Activities Committee, someone accused her of being disloyal to the United States. And in the Dance Theater of Harlem production about my mother, they include a recording of an interview that she did, and it's "Why I Love the United States." And the idea that she was disloyal was so she found so insulting that she insisted, over my father's objection, she insisted on going to the House Un-American Activities Committee and testifying, saying that this was totally untrue. And she read a statement But a lot of people thought, oh, that's going to end her career. No, it didn't end her career. It was the end of the TV show because the sponsors became nervous. But after that, she continued to travel around the United States and do concerts, again, scheduling it so that she was never away on a weekend. Um, and she was a huge success in Europe and in South America. So she was happy, and she was a very, very proud grandmother. She loved taking care of her two grandchildren.
That is just extraordinary. Thank you so much. Thank you, you all. Thank you for joining Inner Beauty TV. Once again, remember, I love you and Jesus Christ loves you. And until the next time, keep the faith, baby.
Chavirera deliciosamente, tu m'appartiens.